All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I spoke here, maybe 10, 11 years ago in 26, North Carolina. And when I heard about the last speaker that didn't cash a check, that was not me. I know how to cash checks. So my topic tonight is probably one that most people have probably never heard of. And that's okay. And being in an area like this where you are home to numerous large battles in the American Civil War, I currently live in a community that has the same in Gettysburg, but the reality is in places like eastern North Carolina, southeastern Virginia, all over where this war took place, it's not Fredericksburg, it's not Chancellorsville, it's not Gettysburg, it's smaller actions. And this is what really marks what we'll see in eastern North Carolina during the Civil War, and one of, I think, the forgotten aspects of the Eastern Theater. I often think of, kind of everything in Virginia, Maryland, a brief detour into Pennsylvania, but eastern North Carolina, southeastern Virginia is always going to play a role in Confederate strategy in central Virginia throughout the entire war. Eastern North Carolina is always going to be, in many ways, a thorn in Robert E. Lee's side. It is the main avenue of supply for the Confederate Army, but also you have to detail at times as many as 12 to 20,000 Confederate soldiers to protect the Wilmington Weldon Railroad. Could 15 to 20,000 Confederate soldiers make a difference at, say, Gettysburg? Antietam? Certainly. So we can see that even though it doesn't have large battles, eastern North Carolina is a critical part of the American Civil War. Now, when we think of New Bern, usually when people think of the Battle of New Bern, March 14th, 1862. Ambrose Burnside wins a battle. Things that have never been uttered in this town before. I get to do it. So what we will see is that is in 1862. By April, May of 1862, much of eastern North Carolina is now in Union hands. And that is going to have a real impact on Confederate strategy moving forward. We will see an attempt in 1863 by D.H. Hill to recapture New Bern, and then we'll see in 1864 the same, this time led by General George Pickett. So there's going to be some names that you are familiar, probably just not in the location that is familiar to you. So what we're going to do is first, when we talk about George Pickett in 1864, we're going to go back to maybe the worst day of his life, July 3rd, 1863. As Pickett's division is filing back to Seminary Ridge, George Pickett will never be the same individual. He immediately seems to have lost control. He has the famous interaction with Robert E. Lee. Later, he is upset that his men are having to guard prisoners on the way back. Also, when it comes time to writing his report on the Battle of Gettysburg. Have any of you ever read George Pickett's report on the Battle of Gettysburg? No. There's a reason why. Oh, he writes it. It doesn't get accepted. Robert E. Lee would not accept reports for two reasons. One, they were incomplete. Finish it up. Or the contents were so inflammatory that it could really impact morale in the Confederacy. What kind of report do you think George Pickett probably wrote July 20th-ish, 1863? It is probably the latter. We do not know what happened to it. It likely burns in Richmond in April of 1865, but hey, tomorrow someone might say I was going through Grandpa's attic, and here it is. We're always one letter of diary away from being completely wrong. But what we will see is that this really starts a really division between Robert E. Lee and George Pickett that never is healed for really the duration of the war. So what we're going to see now is after the Battle of Gettysburg, James Longstreet, two divisions under Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood are sent out west, Georgia, Tennessee. They're going to be part of the Chickamauga campaign. But George Pickett's division, left of it, is going to be tasked with another operation, this time in eastern North Carolina. This is going to be a critical campaign. In 1864, things are not looking good for the Confederacy. 1862 had some successes. 1863 is really turned against them, but there's still hope for 1864. And what the Confederacy was really looking at were what are areas of sort of opportunity for us to recapture. One of those they felt was eastern North Carolina. Union troops captured in the spring of 1862. Beyond that, very little fighting at all. So these are troops that are mostly used to garrison duty, are not used to the rigors of military action, maybe a tantalizing target to be had. So what we'll begin to see is not only Confederates looking at eastern North Carolina as a way to gain some momentum, but also impact Union operations here in Virginia as well. well. If Confederates recapture eastern North Carolina, what is the Union Army probably going to have to do? Send troops to recapture that area. The troops most likely sent would have been the men of the Ninth Corps, formerly of Ambrose Burnside. So think about the impact that would have in the spring of 1864, not having that extra Union Corps for Grant moving forward. So we can see that it's a matter of where we're going to be allocating these resources. So the Confederates are hopeful they can regain parts of eastern North Carolina. It's going to have a major strategic impact and perhaps kind of wind this clock down and perhaps get the election result they're looking for. Robert E. Lee, on January 2nd, 1864, is going to write to President Jefferson Davis. And he is going to note the time is at hand, if an attempt can be made to capture the enemy's forces at New Bern, it should be done. I can now spare the troops for the purpose, which will not be the case as the spring approaches. So Robert E. Lee is already discussing with Jefferson Davis, what do we want to do here? Lee will describe the garrison at New Bern as follows. He will say they are so long unmolested and experience such a feeling of security that it is represented as careless. In closing, Lee stated, in his words, a large amount of provisions and other supplies are said to be at New Bern, which we are very much in want of for this army. Besides, much that is reported in the country will thus be made accessible to us. What do the Confederates need in 1864? Food. Eastern North Carolina can provide that as well. Very quickly, Davis approves Lee's plan. Lee writes Davis on January 2nd. 2 days later, it's approved. Jefferson Davis will write, your suggestion is approved, but who can and will execute it? You can give it form, which would ensure success, but without your personal attention, I feel much failure, as have elsewhere been suffered. It would be well to send a brigade, and if circumstances permit, you had better go down. Otherwise, I will go myself, although it could only be for a few days, Congress being in session. Just think about this for a moment. Davis is possibly looking at Robert E. Lee to come to eastern North Carolina to lead a military campaign. Davis is also talking about going to eastern North Carolina himself to supervise this, which is probably Jefferson Davis's greatest dream of the American Civil War. He never forgot that he was a general in Mexico as well as a former Secretary of War. So we see this is a serious area when you're having the President of the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee really focusing a good bit of attention on this area. The question is, who to command? Robert E. Lee will defer. He will say, my presence is needed here with the Army. I cannot lead, but Mr. President, if you order me, I'll do it. So the question is, who do we pick to oversee this operation? Robert E. Lee actually advocates Brigadier General Robert Hoke. Hoke is a native North Carolinian, very talented commander, and Lee feels he was up to the task. In fact, as we will see, Robert Hoke designs a lot of the strategy that we will see in this campaign. The problem is, Hoke is a brigadier general. He's going to be commanding upwards of as many as 20,000 soldiers. That's a little too much for a brigadier general. So this is where Confederate records are not always what we would hope. There are some serious gaps at this time, but there seems to be a bit of a back and forth between Lee and Davis as to who should oversee this. One of the names mentioned, George Pickett. Now, in the Army of Northern Virginia in 1864, you had a wealth of really talented division commanders, and you go with Pickett. But this is an interesting pick. As Pickett is recovering from the issues he had at Gettysburg, what better chance for him to rebuild that confidence, his troops' confidence, than going into eastern North Carolina, winning a major victory, rebuilding a little bit of that morale for them. Now, since Robert Hoke is the primary architect of the plan to recapture New York, he will join George Pickett, operating more or less as second in command. This will cause a bit of an issue later. So this is eastern North Carolina in 1864. You will see at the very bottom there where it says Fort Fisher, Wilmington, and then look at that rail line running all the way up to Weldon, then to Petersburg and to Richmond. By 1864, that is one of the most, maybe the single most important rail line in the Confederacy. So what we'll see is that guarding that rail line is critical to protecting Robert E. Lee's army, keeping them supplied here in central Virginia. Now, for the most part, much of eastern North Carolina, really from Goldsboro east, is in Union control. But there is an opportunity to be had. So we are looking now at the Confederate High Command. There are going to be some units that we recognize. We will have North Carolina brigades under Robert Hoke, as well as Thomas Klingman and Matthew Ransom, a brigade commander here at Fredericksburg. We will see also the Virginia brigades of Seth Barton, Montgomery Coursey, and James Kemper, temporarily under William Terry from Pickett's division. Minus Coursey's men, these are survivors of Gettysburg for George Pickett's division. The artillery will be under the command of temporarily Colonel James Deering. He was promoted temporarily for this operation. There will also be a naval component to this. If you notice, as you looked at the map earlier, the Neuse River runs right into New Bern. One of the challenges is, even if you capture New Bern, the Union forces have a navy. They cannot be stopped. So how do you prevent that? Well, the Confederates have a plan. They're going to hijack a Union ship and turn it against the others in the harbor around New Bern. Who will carry this out? It will be a hand-picked detachment of naval sailors and Marines led by Commander John Taylor Wood. Wood was a trusted advisor to Jefferson Davis, but he was also his nephew. Probably played a little bit. He's also a talented officer, so it's not just nepotism. This isn't Joseph Davis, folks. So what we're going to see now is, along with the troops under Pickett, Lee requests that help will be given from the Wilmington garrison. The idea is that the supply lines east of North Carolina are incredibly vulnerable. One of the more easiest areas to cut the supply line from Beaufort, Morehead City to New Bern is Newport, North Carolina, as a railroad trestle runs right over the Newport River. So the plan is, as Confederates attack New Bern, you will have a secondary operation looking to cut the rail line at Newport. The idea is to isolate these Union commands, and it's kind of like how you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. The idea is these isolated Union forces, you can isolate them in certain parts of around the rivers and the creeks, trap them, and move against the next. But it will be critical that line from Morehead City is cut, and also the Union Navy cannot be involved. Lee will write to Chase Whitty, the commander of the Wilmington garrison, on January 20th. An attack on New Bern is contemplated by the forces under the command of General Pickett. The time will be between the 25th and 28th. I request that you will give all the assistance in your power, especially by threatening simultaneous with your troops north of the Cape Fear, the enemy's positions at Morehead City, so as to prevent their reinforcing New Bern. General Pickett will telegraph you the day by which you will know what is meant. Commit nothing to the telegraph on the subject and keep the matter secret. If this plan is going to work, secrecy has to be maintained. So the plan that we devised is that George Pickett, there's the supporting commands, there's Wood, and later guy we're going to be talking about here in a few moments, James Martin. So here is New Bern. We will see that by 1864, it is pretty well defended. These are sizable earthworks that you're seeing around the city. This is the efforts of almost 2.5 years of Union Army engineering to protect that city. So it is a well-fortified city. But you can see that it is vulnerable. The rivers and creeks impact the ability to not only reinforce certain areas, but also some of these areas are going to be isolated. So the plan is that Pickett will advance from Kinston on the city from 3 different directions. Wood would descend the Neuse River in launches and surprise and capture Union gunboats located in the river, turning the guns on the Union troops in order to support the infantry attack. Troops from Wilmington will cut the rail line to Morehead City and Beaufort. The plan was developed primarily by Robert Hoke in consultation with Lee, but then it was issued to Pickett to carry it out. This is going to be a challenge. This is a complex, challenging, combined operation. Is Pickett going to be adequate enough to handle this? That will remain to be seen. So here is New Bern in 1864. You will see that it is very much a coastal community, and by 1864, it's the second largest city in the state of North Carolina. Only Wilmington is larger. That is no longer the case. But it was a major community. It was the colonial capital of North Carolina before they moved it to Raleigh. But really, after the capital moved, New Bern kind of had a bit of a decline, but it was still, they said, the second largest city in the state. So here is Pickett's plan of attack. You'll see moving against New Bern in multiple directions. The idea is to prevent Union troops from reinforcing any specific point and be able to gain the town. Brigadier General Robert Hope's brigade will make first contact with Union troops on February 1st along what is called Bachelor's Creek, where he hoped to surprise a Union outpost under Colonel Peter Clausen of 132nd New York. Now, both sides, when this encounter happened, brought up artillery, and the fight began to grow. Eventually, Union troops will begin to retreat back towards New Bern as overwhelming Confederate forces begin to appear in their front, and eventually darkness and fog, as well as some Union reinforcements, cause this action to somewhat be broken off. Hope will then halt his brigade outside of New Bern and waited to hear for the rest of the Confederate attacks. The second Confederate attack was led by Brigadier General Seth Barton as he moved across the Trent River against the 17th Massachusetts under Colonel Thomas Armory, supported by the 3rd New York Light Artillery. The Union artillery opened up against Barton, causing him to believe that the Union defenses he faced were too strong to be able to be reduced by his artillery and his force, so he will pause. Pickett's third attack was led by Colonel James Deering against Fort Anderson across the Neuse River. When Deering came within sight of the fort, like Barton, he too believed that the defenses facing him were too formidable to attack. This is going to be a recurring theme that we're going to see here in this moving forward. Is it because of lack of scouting? Is it a lack of direction? We still have a lot of questions on how this developed. Robert Hope had a very good grasp of this plan. George Pickett, maybe not so much. And what we will see is that both Pickett and Hope did not really work well together during this time as well. So when you're having that friction there, bad things will happen. So Pickett wavers and he hesitates. This is also a general that probably by February of 1864, not that confident in himself as well. So we're really seeing the very worst of George Pickett starting to emerge here in and around New Bern. But not all is a failure. At 2:30 a.m. on February 2nd, Commander Wood and his naval contingent surprised the crew of the USS Underwriter. They will anchor in the Neuse River. Close quarters fighting will take place there. We're talking cutlasses, we're talking pistols. This is a full-blown, like out of Pirates of the Caribbean action taking place here on board the USS Underwriter. The majority of the Underwriter's crew escapes, but Wood's men seize the ship, and they will now set sail downriver to attack the Union Navy. The problem is Union artillery at Fort Stephenson opened fire on the Underwriter first. Seeing it, and they were not going to be able to outrun Union artillery, the Confederates set the ship on fire. Will explode a few moments later. Any support now that Confederate infantry is going to have from the Confederate Navy is gone. This is a critical component that is now gone in this operation. So as things are falling apart around New Bern, you will see an image of Wood's attack on the USS Underwriter. But as Pickett's attacks are faltering around New Bern, another Confederate force is moving towards Carteret County, which is just east of Craven County, where New Bern is. And this is what's going to lead to the battle known as Newport Barracks that some guy wrote a book on a couple of years ago. Right there. So, and when I was putting this together, I realized that if I was just going to do Newport Barracks, it was not going to go over well. So you need to have this overall context, because without the overall New Bern campaign, this battle makes very little sense. So what you're looking at right now is an 1864 coastal survey map of western Carteret County. You will see here that you have a series of roads running through. You will notice there that they actually have the sound, and where you sort of see there where it says, it looks like O-R-D-E-N. Have any of you ever been to Atlantic Beach, North Carolina? In Lyle, North Carolina. That's the island that it's on, to give you kind of a sense of where that is. Now, what you will see, though, is the rail line running from Morehead City off to the right of the image, running up towards New Bern. Crossing the Newport River is Newport at the railroad trestle there. Now, Martin will not begin to move towards Carteret County until January 29th. It was a long, challenging march. In fact, he will not arrive in western Carteret County until February 1st. So the fighting in New Bern's beginning, Martin's just arrived in Carteret County, so we're already starting to see a bit of a disconnect between these two forces. Now, the defenses of Carteret County were pretty solid. We have a number of blockhouses like what you will see here. These were put throughout at critical points to provide support and defend the transportation routes through the county. Now, as Martin is moving, he will actually capture two Union blockhouses, on the morning of February 2nd. He will capture Gales Creek Blockhouse to the west of Boat Sound Blockhouse that you're looking at here. Now, the troops that you'll see depicted, these are the men of the 9th New Jersey. This was taken in the fall of 1862. They arrived in Eastern North Carolina a few months before, and they were the ones that actually built the Boat Sound Blockhouse. This was a photographer from New Jersey that came down specifically to photograph the regiment. So we will see quite a bit of photo documentation of the area here as well. Now, as these Confederate attacks are taking place, he will clear the blockhouses and will then move towards Newport Barracks itself. And this is an image of Newport Barracks. Where this image was taken, the house I grew up in, 3/4 of a mile from where this photo was taken. That was my playground as a kid. So what we'll see is this is a Union garrison here. These are the men of the 9th Vermont. Here you'll see a pretty standard encampment. I mean, does this look very similar to winter encampments you see around this area during the Civil War? Very, very similar. So you'll see that here. And it was a large post. At any time, it could have upwards of 2,500 people at Newport Barracks. To put that in perspective, Newport, North Carolina did not have over 2,000 people living in it until 1980. So think about that for a moment. So this is Newport Barracks itself. Now, after Martin clears the two blockhouses, he's now moving towards his main objective. Now, the two Confederate forces that are going to really lead this attack are the men of the 17th North Carolina and the 42nd North Carolina. These are part of James Martin's brigade that was attached to the Wilmington garrison. They will be up against primarily the 9th Vermont. Now, the 9th Vermont's a pretty hard luck regiment. When they formed in the summer of 1862, they were fully expecting to be joining the famed Vermont Brigade. But other plans. They got sent to Harper's Ferry, where they were there on September 15th, 1862, when Stonewall Jackson shows up, where they will be part of the surrender there. They will later be sent to Camp Douglas in Chicago, and then they will later be paroled and returned to Eastern North Carolina. The brigade commander that they had, or their regimental commander when they were captured at Harper's Ferry, Colonel George Stannard of Gettysburg fame. So what we'll see is now the attack is being made. The challenge is we've got about 2,000 Confederates and about 700 Union infantry. This is a challenge. And what we'll see is the 9th Vermont, in fact, had many green soldiers. Some had arrived just days before. There was accounts of the 9th Vermont actually drilling these soldiers on the morning of February 2nd. They'll be in battle a few hours later. Some of these men have not even been issued muskets. So it is not a good situation bearing down. But the hope is that if the 9th Vermont can buy enough time, they can fall back to the earthworks around Newport Barracks. These are walls that are 8 to 12 feet high. There's a 32-pounder that defends that, what's known as Fort Ripley. 32-pounders are massive guns. So this is a well-defended position. So if they can fall back, they might be able to make a stand there. But another problem arises. The forts that you will see, Fort Ripley and the one closer to the community of Newport, these were under the command of Russell Conwell. He was a captain of the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. He is going to be the captain in command of Company D, who were garrisoning these posts. A few days before, Conwell had been riding around the area around Newport, and a local farmer, he said, took a shot at him. They were often referred to as farmers by day, Confederates by night. So what we'll see is that he goes out looking for this. He eventually wanders away on the day of the battle, all the way almost to Newbern. He will not be at Newport Barracks as this takes place. As a result, his men are going to panic, and just as the men of the 9th Vermont are falling back to the fort, they'll discover the men of Company D of the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery have spiked the guns and are retreating across the river. At this point, this is an untenable position for these Union troops. The question now is how are we going to get across the Newport River and keep the Confederates on the other side? So we will see is there's two crossings. You have the railroad trestle and you have the county road bridge. The idea is to get the units across. Rear guard actions will defend each crossing. Once troops are across, burn the positions and put the river between you and the Confederates. So what we will see is as these is taking place, you'll have 3 rear guard actions. As a result, 3 members of the 9th Vermont will receive the Medal of Honor for their actions at Newport Barracks. For a battle that Navy only has at most 3,000 men, that's a lot of Medal of Honors for a battle of that size. So what we'll see is as these Union troops are falling back, they will fall back to Beaufort. Newport is now in Confederate hands. Martin is now waiting to hear any word from New Bern about what is transpiring there. Eventually he'll be told that the attack has failed and that he needs to withdraw back to Wilmington. Pickett will order his forces to withdraw on February 3rd. Martin is informed, as I said, moves back to Wilmington as well. Now, as the Confederates withdraw, some of the units in eastern North Carolina is a really interesting area because it's not ardently Confederate. You have a lot of pockets of Unionism in eastern North Carolina. In fact, in Carteret County, this battle takes place, the equal of 4 companies of Union infantry were raised in Carteret County during the Civil War, Union infantry. Now, what you will see are also some Confederates that have served in local home guard units in 1861, 1862, who are going to be now, as eastern North Carolina is under Union control. They weren't really ardent Confederates. You're offering me $13 a month. My family's going to be protected. I don't have to worry about anything. Yeah, sign me up. When we talk about that initial encounter between Hoke at Bachelor's Creek, some of the men that were there were the men of the 2nd North Carolina Union Volunteers. They'll be captured. Now, some of these men, as I said, had previously served in Confederate forces. These men deserted, or when it was down in Union control, returned home and later enlisted in the Union Army. When George Pickett finds out about this, he is going to deem them traitors, and what do traitors deserve? Death. On February 5th, the first 2 of these Union soldiers were executed. Now, this is a problem because these are United States troops. You cannot just execute prisoners on a field. And we're going to have a bit of a back and forth between Union General John Peck, who commanded the district in eastern North Carolina, and George Pickett, back and forth. And it can also, when you read Pickett's, it almost sounds like a movie villain almost when you get to it. But John Peck will first write to Pickett, General, I have the honor to include a list of 53 soldiers of the U.S. government who were supposed to have fallen into your hands of the late hasty retreat before New Bern. They are the loyal and true North Carolinians and duly enlisted in the 2nd North Carolina Infantry. I ask for them to receive the same treatments in all respects as you would mete out to other prisoners of war. That sounds fair, right? George Pickett has a different response. Writing to Peck, your communication of the 13th is at hand. I have the honor to state in my reply that you have made a slight mistake in regards to numbers. 325 having fallen into our hands by your late hasty retreat from before New Bern, instead of the list of 53 which you have so kindly furnished me, and which will now be able to enable me to bring to justice any of those who at this time escaped, in Pickett's words, their just deserts. I herewith return you the names of those who have been tried, convicted by court-martial and for desertion from the Confederate service, and taken of arms in hand, duly enlisted in the 2nd North Carolina Infantry, U.S. Army. They have been duly executed according to law and the custom of war. Your letter and list will, of course, prevent any mercy from being shown any of the remaining number, should proper and just proof be brought forth to having deserted from Confederate colors. Many of these men pleading in have said that they were forced into the ranks of the federal government, extenuating circumstances. In all, 22 Confederate turned Union soldiers were executed by George Pickett. 13 on February 15th. Most of these soldiers, when you look at them in the 1860 census, these are poor dirt farmers and fishermen. They're illiterate. They're just caught up in this national nightmare. It's truly hard times for these folks here. They're trying to do the best they can, and now they get caught up into this. Now, why does Pickett respond so harshly? Would he be the first person to act out after a personal setback? No, there's something to be said for that. And also, before this campaign, Robert E. Lee had really started to emphasize the impact of keeping discipline and morale in the ranks. Desertion was really starting to impact the Army of Northern Virginia. You're having a lot more executions in the Confederate Army, perhaps perhaps Pickett got the idea from that, and we don't really know. But it's going to cause him some problems. When the Civil War ends, George Pickett flees the country. He goes to Canada. The reason he goes to Canada, there's a very good chance he would have been tried for war crimes. I think rightfully so. But he escaped, he moves to Canada, where he'll remain for a few years, but he'll return to the United States after being promised by General Ulysses S. Grant that despite public controversy, he would not face any prosecution. So Pickett will return to the United States. In the meantime, though, after the failure of New Bern, Pickett is tossed aside. Robert Hope will take command, and in fact, is going to emerge as a pretty competent commander. Not only is he going to win a decisive victory at Plymouth, North Carolina, which can be argued is the last real Confederate victory in eastern North Carolina in the entire Civil War, and he will then move against New Bern himself, but by May of 1864, what's happening in and around this area we're in right now? We got a lot of movement. Any Confederate troops that are in eastern North Carolina, they need to get up to Robert E. Lee's army. So we'll soon see Hoke and his men departing to rejoin the Army of Northern Virginia, and the last best chance the Confederates would have had to capture New Bern and perhaps gain some momentum will fall to the side. As I say, it's not a bloody battle. There are skirmishes along the river crossings here that are much bloodier than this. But what we see is, I think, very indicative of the type of war you would see in eastern North Carolina. It's small garrisons, small actions, typically maybe a couple hundred here, a couple hundred there. Not what we're used to, 50,000 here, 75,000 here. But I think it's very much telling of this is the war for many of these soldiers. A soldier, say from Massachusetts, that was stationed at New Bern, this is what he views war as, not necessarily what he would have seen, say, at Fredericksburg or Gettysburg. So I think it is an interesting insight to the experience that many soldiers have, and also kind of this bigger strategic picture that plays in as well. As I say, all these pieces connect. Even think about in 1862, when Burnside was preparing his attacks here, there's a secondary front opened up in eastern North Carolina or John Foster as well. So we can see this interconnection between the two. Fast forward, January 1865 into February, Fort Fisher and Wilmington Falls. When Wilmington falls, the Wilmington Railroad and Wilmington Weldon Railroad goes with it. And very soon, a few months later, Petersburg falls, Richmond with it, and more or less the war is over. So it has been a pleasure to spend another night with you guys here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic I don't really talk about a lot. So I'm kind of excited to be able to talk about a bit of home for me, and happy to answer any questions that you